Hey everybody, Eric Trexler here with my dear friend and colleague, the good Dr. Eric Helms. This is Iron Culture Live, presented by the Mass Research Review. If you've been following along the last few weeks, then you know we're trying to get in the habit of doing more live episodes on Monday nights. The typical episode now of Iron Culture is actually going to be live on YouTube, streamed at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. If you haven't been following the last few episodes, you're very confused. You don't know what's happening. You are questioning your reality. And ironically, I found myself in the same place earlier today, Helms. I had like one huge task I needed to do for work. And I woke up for some reason like 3 or 4 hours before my alarm and just started working. So I finished this task, which was very tedious. I was working on an IRB document, an ethics document, which is now 230 pages long. So I got that resubmitted, and I basically had this like 3-hour chunk of time I freed up from waking up early. I passed out, took a nap, and honest to God, Helms, when I woke up from the nap, I did not know what day it was. I was so confused. My phone said 4 o'clock, and I normally wake up around 4 a.m., but it was still light outside. So I thought my phone was broken, and I was like refreshing it. And then I was like, wait a minute, let's start with the basics. What day is it? Not the exact date on the calendar. What day of the week? Let's start there. Then we'll get more specific. And eventually I found my way toward reality. So all of that is to say, if you're watching right now and the screen looks different and it's a different night than you're used to for the live presentation, you will find your way back toward reality one way or another. So don't panic. But yeah, thanks for joining us here on Iron Culture, which tonight is a live presentation. If you've been following Mass Office Hours for a long time, then this is basically same thing, different day. We're going to be doing some questions that were submitted in the overnight, kind of like after hours portal. We're going to be doing some live chat questions. One thing I should note, if you're following the live chat and get, again, extremely confused, it's probably because I messed something up. So right now, we already had one comment. If you're viewing on the Mass page, the Mass Research Review YouTube channel, and they're like, how am I watching Iron Culture right now on my cell phone on the Iron Culture YouTube page and watching Mass Research Review on my computer? So we're actually streaming to both channels simultaneously, which means when I type something into the chat, if I'm not extremely careful, it's just going to go to both. So when someone asked that question, I said, "That's science, baby." And I accidentally said it to both chats. So in one of them, there was no context for that whatsoever. It was just me out of nowhere saying, "That's science, baby." So we're going to get a little bit of that as we get used to this. There's new music. Someone just commented in the chat. Absolutely. And frankly, I think the music is I loved the old stuff, but I think this is a very big upgrade here. So a lot of moving parts here, but we're really thrilled that you joined us on a Monday evening here. So yeah, we're gonna work out the new technology and hopefully just answer a lot of really cool fitness questions as we go along the way. By the way, I want to say, Helms, as someone who is very self-serving and self-interested, the person who commented that they are watching on both channels simultaneously, that's actually the preferred way to watch. And I would argue that if you do have two devices with YouTube access, it's you now have there's a spectrum of support you can give the show. Mm-hmm. If you really love the show and you want it to do well and you want it to even still exist, just reach a level of viability that we can still justify, what you would really do is watch on two devices, grab your partner's device, your wife, your girlfriend, your husband, your boyfriend, grab all their devices and turn it on in the background. What we want to do is basically get a farm of devices going where we're streaming on all possible channels just to get those numbers up. So on top of that, make sure you like, rate, subscribe, review to the show. Tell a friend, send links to it, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, all that stuff. The best way to support, though, and the best way to literally be part of the show is to join us here live on Monday nights. You can always catch the reruns on your favorite podcast platform on Wednesday, but catch us here live. But if you can't, we understand. You can still submit questions by going to massresearchreview.com/office hours, and that link should be in the description of tonight's show. All right, Helms, that's enough stuff on my end. I just, showed people way too much detail from behind the screen. I believe as we've upgraded here, we've gotten into the level of streaming technology where they kind of assume that you have an off-air producer who's punching the buttons and pulling the levers and speaking into the host's ears. I don't know if it was really, if God intended it this way, for me to be creating content while doing it, but I bet 2 weeks after doing this twice, it'll be like riding a bike. It'll be second nature. But Helms, something that's like riding a bike for you is very closely and aggressively following the sport of bodybuilding. And bodybuilding had a big event, and part of this merger between mass office hours and iron culture is, listen, folks, the culture still is going to permeate the show. Going to answer all your fitness questions, but we gotta tip our hat to the culture. And I can think of no bigger beacon in natural bodybuilding culture than the WNBF. You're smiling there as if I was going to say it was you. So I don't think I'm the only person who saw that. But anyway, the WNBF, my understanding is they recently had Worlds, and I was hoping maybe Helms could catch us up on the goings on.
No, absolutely. And
did you think I was going to say you?
100%.
Yeah, I knew it. I knew it.
Oh, that is so generous. Nope, but that's actually a more accurate comment than WNBF did myself. Yeah, a reformed narcissist is still a narcissist, and we'll just leave it at that. So, folks, yeah, I like everything Trex said. We are moving forward. We are here every single Monday. And we will be pushing episodes out to podcast feeds on Wednesday, and you will make it through this and get used to it. And you will have that Reese Kyle moment at a few times, like Trex did, of what day is it? No, the year. For those who remember Terminator 1, fantastic scene. But we're all going to be okay. And one thing that is definitely okay is the state of natural bodybuilding. So unfortunately, I was not able to be there in person this year. I have done so much traveling this year that I just couldn't do one more. I've literally traveled almost every month since February all the way through November, multiple international trips, which I'm not complaining about. It's a true privilege, and I signed up for all of it. But you do get to a certain point where you look back and you go, maybe I shouldn't have said yes to literally everything this year and guarded my own sanity and time a bit. And that resulted in me not being at Worlds. But even watching from afar, if you watch the live stream or if you're just looking at pictures and stories of people being there on Instagram, man, natural bodybuilding is booming and the competitive level has never been higher. And the crazy thing is I said that last year being there, and talked about how, Benjamin Schuster rocking the world and Brian DaCosta taking the throne, and just the overall between the two of them with Dirk Emmerich. And when you look back at the history of modern bodybuilding, you have eras where you could see the level going up. And it almost seems like there's another era every year right now. Because for those who've been following Iron Culture for a while, we had a bunch of the champs on. We had Dirk Emmerich come on and talk about, his success. We had Natalie Hayes come on. We had Becky Pateman. All these folks who did some really impressive things. For example, Dirk Emmerich, he was able to get his amateur win at Worlds as a bantamweight, right? And then go on to compete. Becky Pateman was winning multiple titles, not just WNBF Worlds, leading up to that. There's rare that someone can win the Natural Olympia and WNBF Worlds in two different classes like she did. Natalie Hayes just taking the women's bodybuilding world by storm. And as good as these people are, here are some things that happened this year. And I mean this with all due respect. Dirk Emmerich placed second in the lightweight this year in the pro division. And we actually had a new champion, Zibin Zhu, the lightweight champion, incredible physique. Another really impressive thing that happened is that Amor Fernandez won the pro women's bodybuilding title. I saw her when I was judging in Spain earlier this year, and she blew my mind. And I said to the other judges, you got to get her to Worlds. You put her in any class besides bikini, and she's going to have a really tough time not winning a world title. And that's exactly what happened. She won the bodybuilding title. And Natalie Hayes is incredible, looked fantastic. She came in third. And in second was Zoe Leeming Watts. So women's bodybuilding is on the rise. Some really, really impressive competitors. The top 5 was just outstanding. Not that the rest weren't, but it was just a really impressive class. Pro fit body champion. And I'm kind of, you know me, like Trex, when we say natural bodybuilding, I really do mean bodybuilding. So I tend to focus on like fit
Yeah.
body, women's bodybuilding, men's bodybuilding. I'm probably going to piss off the the bikini competitors, the figure competitors, and the men's fitness, men's physique competitors. But hey, it's me. I follow what I
It's
follow. I
not
love what I
you,
love.
it's Helms.
Exactly. I'm old school. When I started in this sport, there was only men and women's bodybuilding, and figure had literally just come out. Um, but nonetheless, like I said, pro fit body champ, women's bodybuilding champs, incredible. And to me, the most impressive thing was the middleweight division, because this was the return of Babacar Niang, who is arguably up there with Doug Miller as the best natural bodybuilder of all time, potentially, or the best physique. And he did not disappoint. He brought it. For those who don't know, he won 2 WNBF overall world titles. He managed to get a pro card in the IFBB, competing as a classic competitor. Did some time there, and he wanted to come back. I was really pleased to see that the WNBF leadership allowed that to happen, because there was some debate around that, and I think it is absolutely a net win to show the world that a natural can take it that far, what the peak potential is, and then of course to let them then bring that increased fan base back to the sport of natural bodybuilding. So he was in the middleweights, and everyone expected him to just run away with it. But Oscar Moscat, such an impressive physique. He literally looks like a natural Kevin Lavone. The amount of thickness he has in his back and the thickness in his physique, I think that, again, I only saw pictures. I wasn't there, but the battle between Oscar and Babacar was probably tighter than the overall. Just looking at the pictures, I don't know, and I could have seen a justification for it going either way, which is mind blowing. And as good as Benjamin Schuster is, and Ibsen, who were the top 2 in the middleweights, I think they probably would have been 3rd and 4th in the same lineup. And I mean that with tremendous respect to those 2 gentlemen who are top tier bodybuilders. The middleweights this year was absolutely insane, mind blowing. So yeah, that's the type of thing, just to kind of show you how things are leveling up. Another example is that Bada Lakan, Bada, who's also a 2 times world champ, we thought he was going to go in, win the heavyweights, and be battling it out with Babacar, and it's going to be Bada versus Babacar for a little bit of a rematch. He actually placed 4th in the heavyweights, just to give you an idea of how competitive things are getting. And big shout out to Samuel Hartmann from France, who just has an incredibly aesthetic physique, tiny waist, great taper, excellent poser as well. He won the heavies. So it was just, we're looking at people who we thought could not be toppled, who were at the peak of the game just a year ago, who thought we would be reigning champions. And one of them is, don't get me wrong, I think Babacar has solidified himself. I believe he might be the only person, only male, to win the overall WNBF world title 3 times. I could be incorrect on that. We're not the greatest at record keeping in natural bodybuilding, but that might be true. So he has probably solidified himself in my mind as potentially like the current king, or maybe even the GOAT. We obviously aren't going to see some battles to definitively prove that, but man, really impressive. So I'm going to leave it there, Trucks. Obviously, you could tell I could say more, but I won't, because we got history, we got science, and we got culture that we need to talk about, not
Yeah.
just culture as Eric Helms sees it.
And it's worth noting, in American politics, I think there's some kind of law where certain broadcasting stations have to give equal time to candidates for an upcoming election. And we made a deal behind the scenes that for every second you spend talking about a lifting related sport, I get to talk about college football. And boy, is this a week for it. Because Helms, it was one of those weeks where I deep in my heart felt sorry for you. We had 3 big SEC teams lose, going from 2 losses to 3 losses, possibly eliminating themselves from the playoff picture. Who knows? Very, very contentious debate over that. But maybe we'll do an after-hour show where people can listen to me talk about college football. All right, man. Let's dive in here. I will say I'm glad that bodybuilding is thriving. I'm surprised that it is flourishing without me. I thought when I kind of stepped away from competing that that whole thing would wrap up. But, good for them is my official position. And then my unofficial position is really reassessing some things because I thought I was kind of carrying the whole thing. But all right, Helms, we have great questions coming in the live chat, but we also have some great questions that have come in over the last couple weeks in the after hours submission portal at massresearchreview.com. So what I want to do is ask a couple of those. And this is one of those episodes where we have a genuine embarrassment of riches. We have a lot of great questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. But hey, let's pick a spot. Let's dive in. Let's see here. One that I want to address off the top here is we had a question from someone named Stella who said, hello to the good doctors, the good Eric doctors. So finally, a proper introduction in the question portal. They say, is it fair to say that our bodies have a factory error, that they inherently prefer to be overweight? So essentially, we're stuck with curbing our appetites forever in the obesogenic environments that we live in. This is a really cool question, a really insightful question. And I 2 years ago, I would have found it to be a frustrating question because there is a lot of complexity when you look at the human literature. But I have to tip my cap to the good Dr. Herman Poncer, who is, I've been working with him for a year and a half now. I couldn't say enough good things. Genuinely, Helms, when you're collaborating with someone, you spend time with them, and you start to realize that they aren't just confident where they just say things and they have like a 50% hit rate of like sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. He's his hit rate is excellent. And yeah, it's you hang out with him for a while, you start to see that there's a lot going on up there, and he's a really sharp thinker, thinks really well on his feet, and there's just a lot of insight that just kind of like emanates from him through the hallway. So he wrote a paper, published it within the last year, that I think is probably one of the best ways we could look at this through the lens of evolutionary anthropology. So if you want to read the whole paper, which I do recommend, I forget the exact title, but it's got the phrase provisioned primate in it. And it is a really fascinating way to look at it, because his question was, as someone who works in a department that's very focused on primate evolution, not just were humans kind of built to be overweight, but what happens generally speaking when a primate is put in an environment that is inherently obesogenic? They don't need to forage for food all day. They don't need to do the long persistence hunts that humans are used to doing from an evolutionary perspective. They're not on their feet all day, and they have calories available. When they want some nice fruit, it's there, right? So what he was looking at was doing comparisons. So for example, an orangutan who lives in the cushiest sanctuary you could think of, where they're treated like kings, versus an orangutan in the wild. A lemur, again, in the really cushy, really nice sanctuary versus a lemur in the wild. So I think he looked at least a couple dozen primate species where he could have good comparison groups of body size between what he calls a provision primate, so someone who's living the good life, versus a non-provision primate who really has to kind of, put it together. If you want food, you got to go get it, right? And so for humans, which he included in the analysis, the provision primate kind of analogous example was people who live in an industrialized economy where they mostly work sedentary jobs. They get food at the market. They probably drive to the market, really sedentary lifestyles with an obesogenic food environment. And then the comparator group for that was hunter-gatherer populations who do not have market access. And when they want water, they walk to the water source to get it. When they want food, they hunt or they gather, or they tend to their herd, which is also, very laborious. And what was really fascinating, the kind of take-home point of this article was, across the board, primates have this thing in common, which is that when we're living the good life, we tend to take in a little more than we need, and we tend to store that pretty well. So essentially, the gap between provisioned and non-provisioned primate across all these species was fairly consistent and pointed toward a tendency toward, being pretty overweight, but not necessarily like a, snowball effect where you're just continuously getting more and more and more obese over your lifespan. But yeah, pretty overweight as a primate who's living the good life. And so the question is that a factory error? I would argue personally that that is probably, from an evolutionary perspective, much more of a feature than a bug. I don't think if we could go back to square one of primate evolution, I don't believe we would want to tweak that. I think we want to keep that in there, even acknowledging the modern day challenges that it does present as environments get increasingly obesogenic. I think what currently vexes us as something that has us gravitate toward weight gain throughout the lifespan and ultimately becoming overweight or obese, I think that was a really critical feature rather than a bug that got us to the point where we're sitting here talking into computers and microphones. The primates have quite a story. I don't know if you notice this, but you go deep down in the ocean, they're not even doing television yet, all the aquatic species. So primates have really we've done well for ourselves. Like we fly without wings, which is kind of unique. So yeah, it's hard to look at it as a failure. We're doing okay. But yeah, it's a really fascinating question. And ultimately, I think it is a feature rather than a bug. And one thing I will also note as a bit of kind of the good news or the bright side is that when we look away from the provision primate samples and look at the non-provision samples, they are not necessarily fighting crippling hunger and lethargy day in and day out. They're actually quite comfortable. It's just that our kind of natural wiring leads us to consume a little more than we need to be comfortable, and then we get into weight loss cycles where we have to possibly, depending on our approach and the how aggressive our weight loss approach is going to be and how much weight we need to lose, we may have to endure some of that discomfort getting down to a body weight that's more compatible with cardiometabolic health. But I also wanted to address that I don't want to create this as a juxtaposition of overweight versus severely uncomfortable, because that's really not what we see. We see that in both cases, the provisioned and unprovisioned primates, except for when there's a famine, as far as we can tell, are quite comfortable. Generally speaking, we can get what we need when we're in that non-provision state. So yeah, I just wanted to clarify that it's not necessarily a dichotomous situation where you accept, overweight plus gradual weight gain, averaging about 1 kilogram a year until you die, or until you have sarcopenia and start losing muscle mass. It's not that versus comfortable. There is a middle ground that is actually the norm when we look at these non-provision primate samples. All right, Helms. I love that question. I'm obviously biased. That for me is like you getting a question about nitty-gritty bodybuilding stuff.
I really like how you frame that too. And I also like the framing of the question because when I think about a factory error, I think about like something that's been around for a long time and is a base level issue with the hardware. And I think maybe the better parallel for us to think of is that our current software update on humans is not currently great for the modern, cell phone usage, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like we're using Nokias, and Snake is great, but man, I would really like to have, 5G, because we don't have to go back that far before people were not talking about obesity. If you think, honestly, humans have been around a long time, right? Primates as a species and mammals as a species far longer, but it wasn't until not even like post hunter-gatherer, but post agricultural industrial revolution, modern industrial revolution in the most modern societies where we've really started to see this issue, you can look back at Amish communities and people who they have an abundance of food, good tasting food, but they still have to work to get it, and they can't just sit around all day. And you've got people walking, and obesity is extremely rare. And you even have some societies right now that are post-industrial. Like I think the obesity rate in Japan is still sitting at like 2%, So it does actually take a convergence of a number of environmental changes to overwhelm our current software update. So I wouldn't position it as a factory error.
Yeah. And again, you walk into an Amish community, you go visit a place in Japan. It's not like everyone's starving and lethargic. Please bring me some food. It's like, we're good. We're just doing our thing. Yeah,
exactly.
All right, Helms, I'm going to ask you a question here at great personal risk and personal cost, because I feel like I have to address a topic as I bring it up. So someone asked, for hypertrophy training, how important is the eccentric loading portion of the movement? And they basically said, I set up a cable stack in my home, but the eccentric movement seems like there's just less loading the way that the cable stack is set up and designed. And so the parallel I see here is many years ago when people talked a lot about like applied bodybuilding, biomechanics stuff, functional anatomy stuff. A lot of times people would talk about how do we make sure we're getting really good loading and range of motion in the eccentric phase, because that's where we're creating the micro tears and inducing the damage that makes growth happen. Those narratives have shifted so dramatically since even I was an undergrad, where we're no longer saying, oh, micro tears and muscle damage are what we are trying to do in training, right? And what I've found is like, it seems like a lot of the conversations we used to have about how do I really, hack into this eccentric beneficial element for training. Now we're talking, how do I get loading at long muscle lengths for, it seems like all those conversations, we basically did like Mad Libs, and instead of focusing on eccentrics, now we focus on long muscle length. But in the context of the current, the history of how we talk about these topics and then the current landscape, I just wanted to kick this question to you and ask, how important is the eccentric loading portion of the movement? And am I crazy for thinking that a lot of that conversation has just migrated over to the muscle length conversation, and that initially what a lot of people were attributing to a nice, slow, accentuated eccentric, what they were really just doing is maybe just focusing more on some longer muscle lengths as they were doing that? Could be speculating on my end, but what do you think of this question?
There's an interesting history here. And there's interesting physiology here, and there's interesting complexity here. And there's also a very simple, straightforward answer. So without bearing the lead to not piss anybody off, I'm just going to straight up say, hey, the main reason that the eccentric is important is because it is collectively part of the work you're doing, and your muscle is under load during it. And if you were to skip out on the eccentric, you're going to ultimately do less work. So basically what I'm saying is, hey, if you notice, like for your cable stack or whatever your setup, you feel like the eccentric is not as loaded or as challenging. I mean, it should be. I don't actually understand how a cable stack could be set up in a way that the concentric was easy and the eccentric's harder.
I view,
or vice versa, rather.
I view some really poorly made stacks where they just, for whatever reason, they're a little sticky on the way down.
Yes.
And so it kind of feels like that friction, that stickiness is bearing some of the load effectively, if that makes sense.
That's true, because it's resistance that you have to work against on the concentric, and then it's actually helping you break it on the eccentric. I think if you were to simply ensure that you trained to the intended proximity to failure, regardless of the fact that you're probably given a little more on the concentric and you're getting helped a little more on the eccentric, you are probably getting to a very, very similar place. That's the answer I would give. And this is also why I'm not a huge fan of things like bouncing your deadlifts, where you're essentially, or any movement where the eccentric can be performed by gravity and not you. That could be potentially negative. And also in that transition phase where you are at a longer muscle length, if that is happening in an uncontrolled fashion. I'm not necessarily convinced that's an issue, because a lot of the passive contractile element of the muscle tendon unit, what that enables you to like bounce out of the hole in a squat, for example, not bouncing off the floor, to be clear, in a deadlift, but like if you were to do a weightlifter style squat versus a powerlifter style squat, that bounce out of the hole, those besides the tendon itself, but say the titin molecule and a lot of the elastic component of the muscle and things that are not active contractile tissues are also mechanosensors that lead to signaling of hypertrophy to the best of our understanding. And that's probably why training at long muscle lengths, even in muscles where you would think that would not be a good thing based upon our prior understanding of length tension relationships. Like if you were to go back to say 20 years and people were to guess based upon our understanding of muscle physiology, they would go, oh, well, where you have the most overlap between actin and myosin, you can produce the most force. That's what you need to emphasize in your training, right? That makes sense. But in fact, it seems like even in muscles where that is occurring at a shorter muscle length than the stretch position, through various lines of evidence, if anything, you see neutral to positive outcomes in longer muscle length training. So I think that's some useful perspective. To loop in the history of eccentric training, we used to think that eccentric training produced greater hypertrophy or potentially greater strength until a couple of different analyses came out. There was one meta-analysis where I remember they matched differences in load. Because here's the thing, you are 20 to 40% stronger eccentrically than you are concentrically, which is a tough thing to measure, because how much eccentric force you can produce and how much you're not overcoming the load, right? A maximal eccentric is kind of a bit of a fuzzy misnomer. But the point is you can achieve higher forces on the eccentric phase of a muscle action. And that could have been what was driving those findings, is that if you do eccentric only training and you compare it to concentric only training, you're generally using higher loads, therefore higher impulses, higher net tensions in the muscle. But once you control for that, then that effect seems to largely go away. And we've had a rash. That sounds like a bad thing. We've had a lot of eccentric training that's been done in recent years. It is challenging to compare it directly to dynamic training in an ecologically valid way, because eccentric only training is pretty sanitized and not used in a conventional manner in most cases, although there are some easy ways to do it. It's unclear. But there are some interesting things that happen during eccentric contraction. So when your muscles are lengthening under load and you're resisting force, there's actually non-uniform lengthening and shortening of different muscle fibers, which is kind of cool. So one of the reasons that's postulated as to why we see greater muscle damage associated with a similar amount of work of eccentric versus concentric is because of this. And the general consensus that we have, and it's by no means definitive, as to what causes muscle damage is a combination of two factors. It's the initial actual structural strain, the whole quote unquote sarcomere popping theory. And the reason why it occurs potentially more in eccentric training is that when you're trying to control a load and you're getting different motor units being activated and you're seeing this non-uniform lengthening, you're going to achieve, even when the actual muscle itself is not necessarily a super long length, you're going to have some fibers that are at much longer lengths where that could be occurring. So that's one of the reasons why eccentric actions are thought to cause more damage, also because you're generating higher forces. And then the other component to that is, or to muscle damage, is the repair process afterwards. So the metabolic process of actually inducing inflammation to repair that and deal with it, and the DOMs you experience, a lot of that, the reason why it's delayed is because, hey, not all of what we experience as quote unquote muscle damage occurs from the actual mechanical strain. There is the metabolic process afterwards and the repair process. So anyway, the focus on the eccentric comes from a number of reasons. One, that simple fact that you can produce more force, and initial analyses that weren't matched for work seem to induce more strength and hypertrophy. And then I would say kind of that three-factor mechanisms classic paper that came out now, believe it, almost 15 years ago by Schoenfeld, where muscle damage is a potential mechanism for hypertrophy, which has been, disputed to some degree, or at least questioned, because it's very difficult to disentangle it. So, okay, if muscle damage is a thing, eccentrics cause more muscle damage. Maybe eccentrics are good for hypertrophy. So all of that is intermixed into this question. And I don't think it's necessarily fully clear. And we don't have enough data, in my opinion, comparing isometric, concentric, eccentric, and dynamic actions to one another in ways that are quote unquote fair comparisons to know their impact on hypertrophy. But the really simple answer, despite all that history and physiology, it's just make sure you control the lowering phase of your lifts, and you'll grow pretty effectively.
Yeah, and it is interesting that, like, I remember when that paper came out, I believe in 2010, the Schoenfeld paper reviewing mechanisms, and basically there were three proposed mechanisms. And I remember at the time, evidence-based fitness, the world was simpler back then, and a lot of folks, and that's good and bad, right? There's pros and cons to that. A lot of evidence-based fitness folks were kind of like, well, there you have it. We figured it out. We know what causes hypertrophy, and it's in a systematic review now. I think it might have been a narrative review, but narrative review. But everyone was kind of just like, okay, dust our hands off. I'm glad we sorted that out. Let's move forward. And, two of the three were, muscle damage and cell swelling. And, in the years...
Metabolic stress.
Or metabolic stress, kind of working in cell swelling as part of that. And those have been areas of, like, really, I wouldn't say contentious, but really, we're still kind of in the feeling out phases of those bodies of literature. And to Brad's credit, he did not present them as definitive. But that was definitely the impression I think a lot of people took away from it, through their own lens, is like, okay, cool. Now we know the three things. And yeah, there's two of those, where we've spent a great deal of time in recent years trying to really unravel, like, well, how critical is this? How much of a driver is it? And that's, as I said to start this chat with no context, that's science, baby. That's how it works. All right, Helms, I got another question that I really want to throw your way, because this feels like your kind of thing. So we had a question in the after hours chat, probably the last one we'll do tonight, then we'll get to the live chat. The question was, or is and was, exercises where I can brace using multiple points seem like it takes much more effort to push to failure. For example, consider a unilateral cable bicep curl facing the cable using my inactive hand to brace. All right, so cable curls facing the cable, unilateral, using a hand just to brace with some leverage. The alternative is a unilateral cable curl, incline curl facing away from the stack. And so the question really comes down to, when I have more brace points, more areas for bracing, it feels like I have to put a lot more effort in to push to failure. Is this true in your experience? And if so, why?
So we're talking about someone facing the stack. They got their hand there on the stack. They're curling, facing it, or facing away, and
using a bench. It sounds like a cable, or no, an incline curl. Does that?
Yeah, I'm not sure if they mean like a quote unquote Bayesian curl, where their arm is just behind them, like an incline dumbbell curl.
Yeah.
Or if it is supported on something.
What we need is the submission portal to grow out of the realm of text and get more into the interactive video space. But I guess a general question that we can address here is, I'm doing exercises with more brace points, and what are the ultimate, what's the cost benefit of doing that? So maybe I can put more weight on the stack, or maybe I can crank out more reps because of this bracing. Is that helping, hindering, or is it completely irrelevant and I should just go to the same RIR?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think ultimately there's an overarching concept here, is that when discomfort scores, which you can actually measure and have been measured, or general perceived exertion and not necessarily RIR, are measured. When those are higher, those tend to co-vary with other instances where RIR is less accurate. So there's a specific paper by Ribeiro and colleagues where they compare like 25 to 35 RM training to 8 to 12 RM training, higher negative affect, higher discomfort, higher session RPE. And we also know, in the 25 to 35 RM group versus the 8 to 12 RM group, and they used basically a full body training protocol. And we also know if you look at the Halperin meta-analysis on RIR accuracy, we talk about, hey, if you do more than 12 reps, it's going to be less accurate. People really need to actually go and look at the plot and just see how it is this exponential increase. So it's like 13 reps is probably not that bad, but once you're up into 20, it's like they get really inaccurate. And it's like this very clear, like, how we talk about some meta-analyses, they have this quote unquote break point. And you're like, if you took those lines away, I'm not sure I'd see that break point.
Yeah.
This one's clear as day. You don't need the lines. It is like a relatively linear clustering. And then all of a sudden, like Mount Everest pops up, right? So our RIR inaccuracy goes to hell, and precipitously so the higher and higher reps you get, unfortunately. So what that means is essentially that there's some relationship between perceived discomfort impacting the actual RIR, which is sometimes why we recommend things like, hey, if you're doing a compound lift, don't do sets of 20, where you have more muscle mass involved. There's going to be more cardiorespiratory fatigue. It's highly technically demanding. And that has somehow online gotten translated into this, the most stable type of training, the better. Anything that is free weights or compound exercises are bad for hypertrophy. Everything should be isolated, and you need to have like your arm hanging free behind you on an incline curl. Oh my God, that's probably going to make no sense at all. I need to have that tricep against something. And I think this is probably taking a generally true principle and extrapolating it to a point where with a lack of knowledge of the magnitude of how important stability is and where that threshold is and the interaction of skill and experience of lifting, we just kind of take it too far, as we often do. So there's a meta-analysis specifically comparing free weight exercises to machines. And it's primarily on performance and other functional outcomes. But one of the sub-analyses is on hypertrophy. And it's got like 5 studies. So it's not a robust meta. But they've got things comparing like leg press to squats, Smith machine squats to squats, or various machine-based exercises to free weights. And various indices of hypertrophy / body composition. It's by no means super definitive. But the forest plot is very unconvincing that you get better hypertrophy or body composition outcomes if you were to only do machine-based exercises. So what I would put forth is that in a trained lifter, probably the vast majority of your quote unquote typical exercises are sufficiently stable to not create some kind of systemic bias against hypertrophy. And this relates to the brace points, I think, because if you're doing a movement, it's relatively new. And a lot of people right now in the bodybuilding space are doing a lot of new movements. If you watch the way training has evolved, there's people making fun of training in 2024 versus 1990 because long muscle lengths are a thing, because we're starting to uncover and try out these new concepts. And there's, a lot of just kind of visceral reactions of I'm afraid of change, or this is complicated, it's overcomplicating it, we can just go lift weights. And there's something to be said for that at times. But I think there's also something to be said for just simply understanding that, okay, if the cable is facing straight down, it's doing the same thing as gravity anyway, so maybe I should bring it up and be level with my hands so I get initial resistance. Like that kind of basic stuff is not overcomplicating it, as an example. So if you're doing a new movement and it's requiring you to brace in new ways you haven't done before at multiple points, you're essentially just requiring more mental focus on multiple things. And I think that could be what's at play. And it could be just as simple as that when you are more distracted and trying to focus on multiple things, perceived effort, discomfort, and difficulty can be higher. So I would encourage the question asker to reflect, is this a new movement for me, essentially, or a new variation of the movement? If so, let me give it a full mesocycle. If not, and I've been doing this thing for 6 months and it's really distracting and it feels much harder to push to failure, then you're probably better served at finding something with a similar biomechanical profile, meaning is there a resistance profile such that it challenges you at a long muscle length and it gives you a ability to load it and you enjoy the exercise, if there's an alternative that is not as discomforting and you can push to failure, it's probably a better exercise for you.
All right, good stuff. We got another one that's kind of in the same subfield of the fitness world, talking a little bit about like functional anatomy, I guess you'd call it, with and the convergence with exercise selection. But we have a question in the live chat. During compound back exercises, given that the biceps are biarticular, are they shortening at the elbow while lengthening at the shoulder, and therefore not getting a great stimulus for muscle growth? Similar, as the question goes, to the rectus femoris in squat patterns. And so the question concludes with asking, should we count these types of compound back sets as half of a set for biceps when we're making weekly volume, calculations?
And the answer is probably yes, you should. But let's talk a little bit about epistemology, which is how do we know what we know? So,
and by the way, someone in the chat said they liked your philosophy paper. So you just made me think of that. So very lovely chat tonight. A lot of compliments. But please, Mr. Doctor of Philosophy, tell us about epistemology.
I do technically have a Doctor of Philosophy in Sport and Exercise.
Yeah.
I don't have a doctorate of philosophy in philosophy, which would actually be a philosophy degree, but I'll philosophize nonetheless. So yeah, there's actually a really good, I think it's really good, it's my own video that I did for Mass on principles of hypertrophy exercise selection. And I start the whole thing not with here's principle 1, but how do we even derive principles? And I discussed how we generally have functional anatomy knowledge that stems from a few different places. We're not at the point where we have like robust meta-analyses of RCTs on hypertrophy, comparing different exercises, but we do have a lot of RCTs or just controlled trials comparing two exercises and actually looking at hypertrophy. And that's ideal because then we don't have to go off of the assumptions of what might come from our other sources of information, which one would be our understanding of anatomy, which largely comes from cadaver-based studies, isolated muscle, and which it's still robust. Don't get me wrong. We've had anatomists since Galen and before that, and we understand the functions of muscle. And we've even advanced our knowledge of the functions of muscle when you just electrically shock a corpse to how does it function in the real world. We have modeling studies, all that good stuff. And then parallel or kind of similar to that, but maybe not quite as good in my opinion, compared to our textbook knowledge of functional anatomy, would be what I call proxy studies, looking at which muscles are on or which muscles are excited through EMG, or what does T2 MRI tell us about what muscle was trained, or acute swelling to know where blood flow is directed right afterwards. These give us hints at what might have been used more in a given exercise, but they don't actually tell us about the big picture longitudinal hypertrophy. So the question coming down to how much are our biceps being used in compound exercises, the functional anatomy knowledge is, they're biarticular. They're weak shoulder flexors, which I would point out. They're primarily, elbow flexors, right? So might that cause a problem when we're doing simultaneous elbow flexion and in shoulder flexion, or actually shoulder extension? And maybe. And the data, if we look at just the RCTs we had a little while ago, generally we don't see large differences when we compare rows versus bicep curls or lat pull downs versus bicep curls, but they're generally lean in favor of bicep curls being better for biceps. When we look at more recent data, the big meta-analysis that came out by Pelland and colleagues, dozens of studies on 1,000+ individuals for hypertrophy, they tried to see what fit the data best, and they didn't just look at biceps. They were looking at triceps, biceps, pec, quads, and even some hamstring hypertrophy studies, and they found that generally the prime mover, when counted as a full set in a given exercise, and secondary muscles, quote unquote, being counted as half sets, better represented the data. So that doesn't mean that literally every single pressing exercise or rowing exercise or pull down exercise produces the same average hypertrophy for biceps and triceps. But when you look at 1,000 people over the course of 12 weeks and averages, that's a better representation, saying, hey, I'm going to count bench press as half a set for my triceps, and my rows and lat pull downs as half a set for biceps. So when you write programs and you think about things conceptually, 100%. But there are such a thing as better isolation exercises for the biceps. There's some bicep curl variations that are better than others. There are some tricep extensions that are better than others. And there are probably some compound movements that seem to produce more hypertrophy for those secondary muscle groups than other compound movements. And those also vary individual to individual. So long answer to a short question, but I think, yes, you can count them as half sets. Don't think that is literally what's going on in the exact number, especially not for you or someone else. But in aggregate, big picture, that's the best way we have to count things conceptually for groups.
All right, good stuff. Now we have a question here. I'm not sure how to interpret it. There's exactly two ways to interpret it from my view, and it's easy enough to answer both, I think. So the question is, what would be the primary muscles to hypertrophy entirely for the conventional deadlift? And my interpretation is, if I wanted to focus on hypertrophy in a way that will carry over to my conventional deadlift, what muscles would I try to grow? The other interpretation would be, if I do a whole bunch of conventional deadlifting, which muscles am I really effectively promoting growth for? So I'll take a crack at it, and you can go ahead and correct me, fill in the gaps, etc. When I think of the conventional deadlift, which is my native deadlift, it is the one I preferred before injuries became part of my life and before I had any other constraints. It was the strongest for me. It felt very comfortable. And by the way, I should acknowledge, I don't think deadlifting had anything to do with the injuries I eventually would experience. So I want to get ahead of that before I get hate mail. But, for me, when I was really hitting my deadlifts hard and noticing what muscle groups were very noticeably growing, for me, it was glutes and everything up through my upper middle back. Traps were looking huge, middle back. So for me, as someone who I went through, frankly, you'd have to call it a conventional deadlifting phase. It was like the only thing I wanted to do. I was just spamming deadlifts in my programming, and it was a lot of fun. But those are the muscle groups that, to me, were just really standing out as, frankly, growing like a weed. And so if I look at the question the other way and someone were to say, hey, I'm going to do a hypertrophy focused block and I'm hoping it'll carry over to my next strength block, and that's a whole other can of worms. But if I wanted to set myself up for some nice quick gains on the conventional deadlift, what muscles would I try to grow? I would say I'd spend a lot of time on the hamstrings and glutes. And basically I would just get my lower back. I wouldn't focus in necessarily on hypertrophy, but get my lower back and my whole posterior chain strong enough to feel like I can really attack a deadlifting block really effectively and have the resiliency and robustness to kind of hit those deadlifts head on. And that might sound like a contradiction. The fact that I didn't mention, like, hey, you should boost up your traps and upper middle back. Those, from my experience, tend to just fill in without being a rate limiting factor of my personal deadlift. For me, I never was like, I would have finished that repetition if I just had stronger traps, right? For me, it was always, am I getting over that classic sticking point with the conventional deadlift, which tends to be a little bit lower, closer to the ground than you see with sumo deadlift. Or am I inverting that? It's been a while. I've been dealing with chronic nerve pain. I haven't lifted bars off grounds for a while. Yeah, I think usually sumo folks, they often struggle with the lockout, right? And a lot of times with conventional, you get kind of stuck mid-shin.
It depends. So sumo, typically, if you're more and more and more upright and you are a shorter, wide stance sumo deadlifter, if you break the floor, it'll probably go.
Yeah.
I say that being a complete exception to that.
Yeah.
Someone who pulls a little bit round back explosively, and I'm tall, and I sumo deadlift off the floor where it's very hard at lockout. But conventional's also hard at lockout for me.
Yeah.
But
so either way,
if we were speaking generalities, sumo is harder off the floor. Conventional's harder halfway through.
Okay, yeah. But yeah, so for me, when I would hit that kind of standard classical sticking point in the conventional deadlift, which for me, I was totally in the norm there. It was kind of that like mid shin, haven't gotten above the knee yet kind of spot. Um, it was never for, not having strong enough traps or upper middle back was never the limiting factor for me. So I would just let those fill in, and inevitably, in my experience, they will if they're ever gonna grow. But Helms, what do you think about this kind of double-sided question?
Yeah, if we approach it from the angle of, what does this conventional deadlift train? It's everything that does hip extension and spinal extension, right? So it's primarily going to be your spinal erectors, glutes, and hamstrings. Of course, it's a full body movement. And if you think about everything that requires every single vertebrae to lock out, then yes, traps and other things are going to be involved. You have to brace very hard. There's a ton going on. And also, depending upon your limb lengths and position, there may be a fair amount of quadricep going on, right? And if you come from a Olympic weightlifting background, where you try to stay as upright as possible, because you're actually doing deadlifts to help you get into your clean even more, right? And you're wearing also heeled shoes, so you're driving your knees forward. There's going to be a greater torque around the knee. So anyway, that's what I would propose. As far as what should I try to hypertrophy to get better at deadlifts long term, this is an interesting question because it kind of goes back to our eccentric conversation. Deadlifts hypothetically should be a pretty good vehicle to grow the muscles related to deadlifts. However, they tend to be done in such a way that people are not controlling the eccentric. They tend to have a pretty high overall fatigue on the body that makes it difficult to accumulate a fair amount of volume. And when people I have worked with have struggled to get good at deadlifts, doing things like giving them RDLs, giving them accessory work like weighted back extensions, good mornings, thinking about what is going to challenge the glutes and the hamstrings in a similar way, but probably more effectively, and that requires me to do an eccentric and also in a safer, less fatiguing way, has sometimes been a really important aspect of them building up their long-term strength potential, if you will. So yeah, I would agree.
All right, good stuff. Now, I want to make sure that we give the people what they came for, right? We are so appreciative of everyone who joins us on the live chat. And frankly, I say this with so much admiration and respect and love and appreciation. But the people who joined us live on the stream tonight are absolute sickos. Like, these are, there's like people who wager for fun and then just the complete degenerate gambler. These are the degenerate mass folks who,
let's go.
Because I don't believe we really advertised this in a meaningful way and said, hey folks, we're switching the night to Mondays. So if you picked up through our terrible messaging and lack of communication about this and still showed up, first of all, thank you. Second of all, you may have a problem. And it's the best problem to have. So we love having you here, and we want to make sure we address some questions. So, Helms, we're going to do the thing we always fail with. We're going to do the rapid fire. Okay?
I'm ready.
So, first question is about mini cuts. Mini cuts with larger deficits, so more aggressive. Any thoughts on doing that so you have a longer, kind of leaner bulking phase and spend more time on the calendar within a caloric surplus? Would muscle memory quickly offset any potential muscle loss during the cut? My answer is maybe. If you enjoy doing mini cuts routinely throughout a bulking phase, I'm not going to beg you to stop, and I'm not going to suggest that it is undermining all of your goals. However, I do have a firm preference for the alternative. I don't like to do a lot of banking on the idea that I will pre-plan short periods of muscle loss into my bulking phases. I prefer a much slower, what I would call a more linear approach, where I get to a body fat that I feel really comfortable maintaining at and I feel like I can really grow with. So not too lean, not so over my goal weight that I'm going to immediately feel like I've gone too heavy with my bulking stage. I'd like to get to the lower end of that range that I want to maintain for my off season, get all my training variables and my dietary variables really tightened up and go for it. And I like to bulk for many, many months on end if I can, and just kind of keep things simple so that I'm not doing that constant back and forth. Sometimes when people, as an extreme look at it, they'll get into this really high volatility cycle of huge surplus for a few weeks, aggressive deficit for a few weeks, massive shifts in glycogen, massive shifts in water weight, massive shifts in gut food content. And frankly, they go through 6 cycles of this, and all of a sudden they look back, it's been several months of training, and they genuinely don't know if they've gotten anywhere. Like that's not a super rare thing to hear about. So I prefer to keep things simple, but if you like to incorporate some mini cuts, I don't think it'll be the end of the world. I think you'll have a lovely lifetime of lifting either way. But for the reasons I mentioned, it's not my preferred approach. Helms, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this does change a bit if you're competing, because there's probably an appropriate place to start a diet. And you know where your endpoint is roughly going to be. You should plan off your old stage weight, assuming you got in shape, as kind of like a best, worst case scenario. If you got bigger, great. You get ready early, you eat up, and you're going to have to think about the timeline. So as an example, I'm starting my diet for 2025, beginning of April, because that'll give me about 6 months to get in shape. And I want to start that around 87 and a half kilos, around 190 pounds, because that puts me about 15 pounds over my last stage weight, which hopefully is maybe a little lighter than this time, right? So getting up to as heavy as 201, 202, that's probably where I want to cut it off, because I'm like, I'm approaching 30 pounds over stage weight, which isn't crazy as a guy at 6 foot, but that's not where I want to start my diet. So that means currently I'm doing a mini cut through the end of the year to get down to a little bit under where that starting point is, where I want to be at, like 193, I think is actually the weight I gave you. I want to cut down to around 190, slowly get back up to around 193, and then diet from 193 down to 175 to do it in freedom units for everyone. So you have to think about that time frame. But ultimately, the best understanding we have of building muscle is that you just don't want to be in a deficit. And the larger the deficit, the more it inhibits your ability to build muscle. And then the leaner you are, the more it increases the likelihood. So one of the things behaviorally that I like to point out, and this is not rapid fire at all, but this is really important, Trex, is that the severity and the frequency of mini cuts that you find yourself doing should be an alarm bell for you to focus on, that perhaps you're taking your bulking approaches too casually. You're just kind of going, sweet, I don't need to think about it. I'm just going to eat and have fun and live life, which is a very, 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 very understandable thing to do. And I would love to live life that way and just kind of have it be sport supportive. But it probably indicates that you don't necessarily have nutrition habits in place or competence that is supportive of your goals, if it is to put on as much muscle as possible. And you're actually short-circuiting yourself because you're in much larger of a surplus than you could possibly benefit from, prompting these mini cuts. And then you're forcing yourself into these larger deficits because you want to get that done and back into a reasonable body fat and then do it again. And if we look at the data on binge eating disorder, or tendencies even towards those types of symptoms, the more you restrict, the more it predicts binge eating. So people who then go through this phase of pretty extreme mini cutting, they come out of it hungry. And it sets them up for exactly what you were describing as that cycle. I also find that you learn very little from extreme mini cuts that are essentially protein modified fasts, right? You do that as no applicability to your eating habits. And then you go back to just eating whatever, and it is this cycle. So it's two potential issues that are both sides of the same coin. You don't really have a lot of nutritional competency to do anything except for just overcompensate on your diet. Like, I know how to eat protein and veggies. I haven't actually thought about how do I make some food swaps, maintain the same eating structure, go about my day-to-day life and drop calories by 600, 700, and then just get my step count up a little bit. Boom. 1,000-calorie deficit, still a relatively aggressive mini cut, but you're not just going right broccoli and chicken for 4 weeks. And then when you go back into it, your bulking phase, it looks totally different again. And I think the goal of what you want is to have more qualitative similarities, even if the quantitative differences are pretty big, in your off-season versus mini cut versus even for a competitor, your contest prep phases, because that's really what's going to give you that behavioral control long term so you don't find yourself in this cycle.
Yeah, good stuff. And you and I have both gotten so much more interested in eating behavior over the years. I feel like back around 2012, I was like, whatever, I want to focus on the macros and that's all I want to think about. And over time, you start to realize like we need to move away from the trees and start looking at the forest a little bit. So if you're listening and you're not all bought in on the hype surrounding a more comprehensive and holistic view at eating behaviors, I would encourage you make that transition when you're ready. But if you can, make it sooner rather than later, because there's a lot more to nutrition than hitting 3 numbers on a daily basis, to the best of your knowledge. All right, quick question here. Benching, 3 sets of 8, 2 reps in reserve for each of those 3 sets. First set, I'm getting 10 reps. Second one, I'm getting 6 reps. Third set, I have to lower the weight because I'm not going to get anywhere near 8. Is that expected? Is there a better way? Do you think it's as simple as just we either need to build up endurance through training stimulus, or we need to increase rest period between sets, or do you think there's something else going on here?
My immediate thought is the person is doing one of 2 things. That 2 RIR is actually a 1. Because the 1 movement, especially if you're a typical male, and you very well may not be. You may not be male. You may not be typical. You may be neither. But having been in the gym, in the lab a long time, you see different, in RPE-based studies, I see very different 1 RIRs on bench press versus squat. I've even seen some people miss a bench press, call it a 1 RIR, and say they misgrooved, and then have clearly 3 left on the squat from 5 minutes prior in the same person and call it a 1 RIR. So
that's my best. I just want to say I have had clients in the past who it's like my training spreadsheets I would send out would be very comprehensive. So I would have a clear understanding of what happened and why. Like all the things you would need in that spreadsheet were there for reporting clearly what happened. And I would find these sets of bench press that it's like target reps 8, actual reps 6. So you failed too shy of the target. RPE or RIR, I think I had 2 left in me. And then I probe and say, what happened here? They're like, I mean, technically I reached failure, but like, come on. I clearly had 2 left in me. And I'm like, no, you didn't. You didn't misgroove it. You just failed. And for some reason you're telling me you had 2 left in the tank. And I'm not mad at you, but we should probably talk about that if we're going to do RIR.
They want to believe.
Yeah.
And I love it. So I think the most likely thing is you're just not resting long enough. That's my immediate thought.
Yeah.
And you probably just want to see what happens if you actually clock your rest times. Because sometimes you'll be like, oh, I thought I was resting 2 minutes. I actually rested 1 minute and 10 seconds, And then if it is 2 minutes, try 2.5 minutes and just see what happens. You may just be cutting it a little short for you. So yeah, I would check those 2 things. First, just try resting 30 seconds longer than you currently are. See if you get another rep. If that happens, then you know what the culprit is. Yeah. And then from there, maybe videotape it and see if that's really a 2 RIR. Another way to do it is take your last set, think about when you hit that 2 RIR, and then keep going. If you get 2 more, great. If you get 3 more, oh, actually you weren't off at all. You're underestimating a little bit. But if you only get 1 more, then you know it's actually a combination of problems.
Yeah. All right, we had a question from me in here. Apparently, there was recently a case study on a Tour de France athlete who expended 7,500 calories per day, and they're asking if I have any comments on it. I'd be happy to provide some. If you want to send me an email, massresearchreview@gmail.com. If you want to send me a copy of that paper, I'd be happy to take a look at it. One thing I do want to get ahead of is I have noticed some situations where it's mostly well-intentioned. People have heard me say like that there's this kind of soft ceiling, soft limit of energy expenditure at 2.5 times an individual's basal metabolic rate. sometimes people will find a case study or an instance where they say, well, this person was at 3.1. Please help me understand this and resolve it for me. Much more rarely, you'll get a situation where someone says, I told you that you don't know anything about the world. Here's a person at 3.1, which is over 2.5, my calculations tell me. What's really important to understand about that physiological ceiling is that it corresponds to, the best way to describe it is by looking at a picture. There's a really great article by Thurber and colleagues in 2019 that plots this kind of curvilinear line that shows metabolic scope on the y-axis, and critically, extremely critically, on the x-axis is time. How consistently, day after day after day, are you trying to maintain this super high energy expenditure? When we say 2.5 appears to be kind of like a ceiling or a limit, what we're talking about is where does that curvilinear line essentially reach a flat asymptote? And what that really looks like is that if you adopt a certain amount of physical activity, a really high amount, and you try to maintain it for the next 9 months, day after day after day, or, you know, throw a couple rest days in there per week as you see fit, but you get the idea. It is exceedingly unlikely, and to my knowledge, still has not been observed that you can maintain meaningfully higher than 2.5 times your basal metabolic rate consistently in the long term, which I would categorize as 9 months and beyond. So sometimes just to kind of get ahead of that without seeing the paper, that's something that's really important to note. And usually when I explain that to people where there's some confusion, we look at it and we say, oh, they did it for 3 weeks. And it's, you know, and what I really like to do out of pure interest, because I don't care if that theory fails, because it's not mine. It's not the Trexler curve. I don't care. I have nothing writing on it. I find it fascinating. What I like to do is say, okay, well, let's see how long this activity was, and let's see where it falls on that Thurber plot. Is it above the curve or under the curve? So far, it's always been under the curve or close enough to the curve that you'd say, okay, you know, for a case study, measurement error, variation from person to person, I'm not really going to rewrite theory on this, right? Where it's like just a touch above the line. But that's kind of some context, but please do send that, because there's 2 papers in that general vicinity that I've been meaning to read. One of them I was unable to download because it was like too early. It was like my university, you know, like universities have very particular pathways to access papers from certain journals, and sometimes they're just hard to get when they're fresh off the presses. So I was like too early and I couldn't get it yet, but I should have access now. But always easier if you just send it to me and then I can read it and let you know what I think. And I appreciate, by the way, people who bring these to my attention. It's really cool. Helms, question here about latent or delayed hypertrophy. And the question is, you're deep in a cut and you don't immediately make gains from the training that you're doing. Could this make it easier as you kind of make your initial gains in a subsequent bulking phase? Now, this is something that has been covered in the Mass Research Review, I believe, once, and it was a few years ago. I think the paper was published in 2018. So this was a while ago. I'm not sure that we've revisited since. And the reason I bring up that paper is because it was looking at a very different view of what we would call latent or delayed hypertrophy. It was basically like, we're going to give you a very effective short-term training stimulus. Then we're going to have you not train for a little bit. And we're going to see in a fairly short time window if it looks like gains are kind of continuing from that recent training stimulus in conditions that are conducive for muscle growth. And I think if memory serves, what they found was that whole muscle size wasn't really continuing to get bigger, but cross-sectional area of the muscle fibers at the fiber level seemed to be kind of having some kind of delayed growth response. Now, an important question there is, man, muscle fiber, when you look at hypertrophy on the fiber level, I'm not knocking it broadly, but I can think of more than a few cases in the literature of really anomalous findings for fiber level hypertrophy that are hard to make sense of. And I'm sure Lauren could come on here and tell us exactly why that is. But I mean, the reality is humans are a mixed muscle species. Not every fiber in a particular muscle group is exactly uniform in terms of size and characteristics. And every time we pull muscle fibers out to assess their area, we're sampling a little chunk of fibers from a given spot in a muscle. So there is some variation and variability that tends to be observed, even though theoretically you would think that's without a doubt the most straightforward and best way to possibly look at hypertrophy, because it's literally the growth of fibers, right? But we can't track the growth of one fiber over time, right?
True.
We're looking at kind of a little grab of fibers here, a grab of fibers there. Do we feel like things are generally getting larger? So that's my personal bias, is that when I look at distinctions between muscle cross-sectional area or MRI muscle volume over time, and I'm struggling to reconcile that with fiber level indicators, I generally, after I've accounted for the fact of, or for the consideration of muscle swelling, I tend to care a lot more, honestly, about growth at the muscle level. Because, Helms, if I told you that your bicep curls are making your fibers bigger, but your sleeves aren't getting any tighter, I feel like you kind of don't care, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we're into muscle growth for the growth of the muscle, rather than if for some reason we find ourselves in a situation where, hey, just so you know, that muscle at the whole muscle level has not changed at all, but I want you to know, and I want you to feel good about the fact that the fibers are bigger. I don't think that's going to give a lot of people a lot of joy or peace of mind. But anyway, like I was getting at initially, that paper, that paradigm is extremely different from saying, I'm in a cut, I'm in these kind of this constrained environment with these parameters that are really not conducive of muscle growth, but I'm still training in a way that hopefully will cause growth. Is it possible I can keep that in the bank, and once I start eating more again, I'm going to be tapping into those gains? I find that to be considerably more unlikely, and probably not directly related to the best evidence we have on this concept of latent or delayed hypertrophy. Now, Helms, this is an area where I spend none of my day thinking. I wouldn't be shocked if you completely disagreed, and I won't be upset. So what do you think?
I think this is a really interesting question,
Yeah, I agree
because,
on that.
yeah, I think we have to acknowledge that the body has, in multiple organ systems, the ability to respond to things out of sync of the time course. And that serves very clear evolutionary, benefits, right? The whole concept of muscle memory is intertwined with that. And I have seen some very interesting things in my years as a personal trainer and as a as in the bodybuilding scene, where, for example, one kind of cool thing I've seen multiple times is someone who has been chronically dieted and got into competitive bodybuilding early, and they finally give themselves an off season, and they see a kind of growth that is disassociated with the acute training program. And it seems to be like I know a guy who almost seemed to have a second puberty with finally eating again. And it's just kind of interesting you might be doing the work, the signaling, and creating the scenario where your body's going, yeah, I really do need to clearly, 'cause it keeps happening, right? And we're shrinking, we're getting unhealthy. I've got reds up the wazoo for this person, and I need to adapt to this. As soon as they give me food, it would probably be beneficial if I could make them more robust to this next time. And that seems to be what you observe sometimes. And the study that you were referring to in mass is one by Bjornson, and it is a really unique one because it's untrained individuals, and they did high frequency, low load blood flow restricted training to failure. So if I recall correctly, they were doing like 2-a-days or daily blood flow restriction training to failure, being untrained. And you saw this pretty substantial decrease in muscle fiber muscle fiber size initially that then rebounded back up and then came actually pretty positive when you look at the during the like unloaded I'm not training phase, just rest, which kind of seems to kind of speak to the same effect. And the whole level stuff, it kind of like came up and then dripped down and then came back up and then stayed. And if you were to think about, okay, well, what's going on here? Why is there this disassociation? If you're training so hard like that you're actually seeing atrophy, what that means is you're creating a tremendous amount of damage and you're actually like causing fiber necrosis. So the level of inflammation that these people are experiencing is going to potentially show up at the whole muscle level, but not in the muscle fiber hypertrophy assessment. So my guess at what went on in that study of why we see essentially just like an increase, a slight decrease, and then a plateau, but not a dip, which is interesting. You know, after that second block of training of BFR, they just kind of maintained, is that you're seeing the interplay between inflammation and growth, and that you can maybe perhaps see a better picture of that growth with all the limitations you mentioned aside when looking at the fiber level cross-sectional area where type 1 and type 2 like decreased and then came up and then peaked after a period of time not training. And I think the key piece here is that these are untrained individuals.
Yeah.
And when we look at other data kind of looking at this in a different way, there's the DeMoss study that got a lot of attention, where you saw that muscle protein synthesis rates were not strongly correlated with hypertrophy until they quote unquote corrected for the damage, right? And that makes sense. Like, you know, if muscle regeneration, when we're looking at gross muscle protein synthesis measures, looks the same, and that's muscle protein synthesis, right? Muscle regeneration looks the same as hypertrophy. It would make sense that before we start trying to build, you know, new muscle, we would need to take care of all the damaged tissue. And again, that was initially untrained people in DeMoss. So I think the untrained aspect makes it seem like it's less ecologically valid towards the question, but I think it creates an environment where we're seeing people who can have a robust adaptive response to a stimulus. And when it is initially too much and overwhelming, that's not a good thing to be like, oh, no, sorry, too much, couldn't adapt to it. You know, like if we think about evolutionary biology, everything's going great, famine. Everything's going great, war. Like we need to be able to deal with that. And the humans who can't aren't going to be alive.
Yeah.
Right. So in my mind, I would postulate, based upon no direct evidence whatsoever, that there are going to be morphological adaptations broadly, including hypertrophy, in response to a stimulus that you can't currently adapt as effectively to. But there's probably some limit to that. It's probably not as effective as if you could actually meet the demands now. And I think that's really neat, but I don't have any way to quantify that or give you effect sizes on that or anything to that nature.
Yeah, I agree. And the two kind of caveats I was going to mention, one of them you brought up already, which is that I'm very on board with the concept that this likely exists for the reasons you laid out, but there's got to be a window, right? We can't just say like, hey, come on, I trained really hard 6 years ago. I'm finally eating again. Like I deserve some gains here. Like there's got to be a time window where whatever signaling and morphological and signaling related changes you induced are they've just been lost to time, right? So who knows how long that window is, but I personally, I'd say we're talking measured in weeks, probably not days, probably not months, in my opinion.
I think I would agree because this is where it's useful to look at another area of research, and that's overreaching and overtraining syndrome research.
Yeah.
For the record, we maybe have one study I've been able to find on where true overtraining syndrome occurred in pure resistance trained athletes.
Yeah.
And just for the record, that means longer than multiple months of suppressed performance that even when you rest does not come back up to baseline. It goes no higher than that or remains suppressed. Functional overreaching is where it's not that long. It's less than months that you've had suppressed performance. You restore recovery, you take time off or you do a deload or whatever, and then you improve performance. And then non-functional is basically just short-term overtraining. It comes back to baseline, doesn't go above. So the difference between functional and non-functional overreaching, which both have been observed, is just how much of a hole did you dig, right? And if you dig a bigger hole, if we think, oh, you're just going to get this unlimited delayed compensation, there would be no non-functional overreaching. But what really happens is that you dig such a hole where you're experiencing so much fatigue that you go for a long enough period where you can't actually induce overload. Your fitness is so acutely suppressed from fatigue that you can't do enough volume, lift heavy enough, focus, or if we think about it, the more common arena where overtraining is observed, endurance sport, concurrent training, team sport athletes, right? You're just not going to be able to get to a pace that even maintains your current level of fitness. So your fitness is actually coming down, and then you have to take time off. So your fitness doesn't come back up, it even goes down further. And then when you come back, your body's doing the best it can, but it seems to be insufficient to get you even back to where you were. So that's one of those reasons why some of the suppositions we have about, oh, you've got to super compensate and you've got to, overreach to be, more effective. You will rarely hear Eric Helms say the word super compensate in a non-critical way, because I think it provides this misnomer. It's almost this belief that I have to induce enough fatigue so that I need to super compensate. And I don't know that that's necessarily true. We don't actually have solid data that functional overreaching for all aspects of fitness, or even for a few, produces better outcomes than just really, really hard training that you can recover from in a shorter time period.
Yeah. Yeah. So like I was saying, I think the one caveat is there's got to be some time limitation to this, some time window. The second caveat that may explain some of what you described previously. So the idea, and I've seen this as well, where someone is like, hey, I want to get into bodybuilding, but they're really ambitious. They frankly start competing way too early, where they're really, frankly, to be honest, they're just a skinny person who enjoys lifting, but has not actually put their base kind of like beginner gains muscle on. And like, hey, more power to them. They love the sport. They want to get on stage immediately. Who am I to stop them? But I think one thing that's interesting is when they finally get the message, Helms grabs them by the shoulders, looks them in the eyes, and says, the sport is called bodybuilding, and we need to build a body if we want to make the waves you want to make in this sport. What's interesting about that is we're seeing this kind of combined effect of people who basically passed on their beginner gains due to like dietary constraints, but in most cases have leveled up from like a beginner lifter to really an accelerated time path to being kind of squarely in that intermediate lifter range. And I think it is I think there is some element that exists beyond any kind of delayed signaling or, delayed hypertrophy, where we're basically in a weird instance where we're looking at a person who has intermediate level lifter lifting habits and experience and knowledge, very, in most cases, in this type of kind of general situation, a person who is really wise beyond their years in terms of nutrition and their eating behaviors. And we're just dropping them in a situation where it's like they've never had beginner gains on a meaningful level. And so I think some of those things also play into that situation where you say, dude, if we just get you to take what you've already learned in the gym, what you already learned about eating, and we just get you to focus on lifting hard and eating enough for 6 months, you are going to look like a different human being, So there's a lot that goes into that in terms of knowledge, behavior, habits, and really suppressing growth that should have been happening all along, but just didn't get the opportunity from that extreme dietary restriction. So yeah, practically speaking, that sure looks like delayed hypertrophy, but again, I'm not sure how far back in the memory bank we can go from a physiological level. You just start, when I took a class in really great class here at UNC's nutrition department. It was their nutritional biochemistry, but there was so much talk about different types of cell signaling and different signaling pathways and kind of the time course of different methods and mechanisms of cellular communication. And it's just extremely atypical to have any kind of signaled process in the body that's like, hey, remember 3 months ago? Like we just really don't see that in cell-to-cell communication and kind of the cellular processes that stem from that. So But either way, I mean, that was a really fascinating question, and
Hmm.
I take the blame for introducing it during the rapid fire section. Question here about how to tell if you're a creatine non-responder. I think the easiest way, personally, sometimes people they do a loading phase and they gain weight and they say, "Oh, clearly I'm a responder." Not so fast, folks. If you look at some of the research on creatine loading, it's not unusual at all to find weight gain in the placebo group. And
Mm.
my speculation, which needs further confirmation, but it's mine, I get to have it, is that folks are gaining water weight because even when they're in the placebo group, they're getting like a 16 ounce or 20 ounce fluid ounce placebo beverage. And they're saying, here, have this four times a day and add this to what you're already eating and drinking. And over a 1 week period, they're just kind of bloated up because they're like, I just increased my daily fluid intake by
Yeah.
80 ounces. So it's not unusual for us to see increases in total body water and increases in body weight in the placebo group of like a kilogram or a kilogram and a half. So what I would recommend instead is what I kind of call like a semi-dosing protocol or a semi-loading protocol where you do 10 grams a day, 5 in the morning, 5 in the evening. If you can, mix it in something you were already going to drink anyway so that you're not having a huge change in your fluid intake. See how that goes for 3 or 4 weeks. If you notice weight gain, if you notice that what used to be 10 reps becomes 13 reps, those are kind of the two indicators that are most accessible. It's not going to be muscle mass. It's not going to be 1 rep strength. It's going to be, how do I feel when I reach rep 10? Do I feel like, hey, where did that extra 2 reps come from? That's creatine. And so I would recommend going that route. And then after you've made your decision, is this worth it or not, after doing that for 3 or 4 weeks, probably drop down to more of a maintenance dose of 5 grams a day whenever you feel like taking it. That's kind of the approach I would advise as someone who's, done a little bit of creatine research in my day. Um, Question here from someone who, by the way, their little profile icon is a some album art from Radiohead, so they're already at the top of the list. You submit a question with a Radiohead logo, you're gonna get your question answered as long as I'm alive and running the show here. The question is, where can you find reliable information on velocity based training?
Oh.
Boy, do I have some
Ooh.
news for you. So they said, I'm doing my final engineering project, developing an encoder for it. I'm finding it hard to get consistent information. My friend, let me
Oh man.
explain to you the concept of what we call the mass research review. The good Dr. Mike Zordos has written more about velocity based training than anyone I'm aware of in the fitness industry. And his articles in the Mass Research Review are extremely detailed, a lot of examples. I would be stunned if you don't find what you're looking for. And so, what I will offer to you, you're working on your final project. I assume it's November 25th. I know how academic calendars work. You probably got about a month to put this thing together. I am asking you to take a leap of faith. Subscribe to the research review
At the student rates, Trex.
at the student rates, which we do offer. Subscribe to the research review. Go to the search tool within the member site. Put velocity based training. If we have like 64 episodes of office hours at this point, go back and find me when I made a hard sell like this on an episode. I've never done it. Okay. And that's the thing about video. It exists. You can go find it if it exists. But seriously, I believe you are going to be a much happier person if you do check out the Mass Archive, because we have so much in there for you. Whether you stick around or not after the semester ends, that's up to you. I think you'll like what you find. But seriously, as someone who has been in that situation, and Helms, you did a PhD, I did a PhD. Every now and then you find yourself in a situation where you say, I have a need for very specialized information and I have no idea where I'm going to find this. And it's like, would I pay $30 or $20 or $10 to just have that information right now? I've on so many cases been in the position of saying, of course I would. I just need this information. So I highly encourage you to check it out, and I think you're going to be happy that you did.
Yeah. So just to put this out there, most of the time, we have categories within mass. You can look at our monthly issues. You can look at volume 5, issue 6, or you can go to our articles by category and you can see programming, and then there's subcategories within there. There are so many velocity-based articles. It has its own subcategory called velocity and technology, which, by the way, it's mostly velocity, and there's 33 articles. So, and some of those are videos if you want to actually see it. So just saying, there's a lot of content. We can't get Mike to stop writing about velocity-based training.
Yeah,
we try. He won't stop. His velocity is just over. We can't overcome it.
no, we can't. And the person who asked that question mentioned that they're from Argentina, and they did the Argentina laugh in the chat. So instead of HAHA, it's JAJA, which I think is awesome. I should acknowledge, if you prefer Spanish as your means of reading the articles, we do have a Spanish version of Mass as well. So
yes,
whatever you think is going to be, and that becomes important when it comes to like someone who's working on a science project. I've got colleagues for whom English is not their first language, and sometimes they can access original papers in their native language. And when the devil's in the details and you're doing scientific work and the interpretation's critical, whatever language you feel more comfortable with, we have both of them in this case, and sometimes that can be critical. We don't talk about it as much in exercise science because everything just kind of gets shuffled into English eventually in the publication pipeline. But there's a lot of fields where frankly, in some fields, the whole field is about what is the most appropriate translation of this text, which is in a dead language. And, this translation is completely distorts the meaning compared to that translation, right? So we've got a great team who puts together our Spanish issues, and I don't think that there will be entire departments in the future trying to decipher the original Mass texts and figuring out if the English or Spanish one should be fit into the canon of whatever spiritual book is being put together from our works. Do you think that's the case?
I don't think we're going to be alive to know. It's very possible. I'm not ruling it out.
If a committee forms to establish a religion and an associated holy book, I want to make this as easy as possible. Technically, they were all originally written in English, and those are the truest and closest translations that you can use for theological purposes. So there you go.
I'll co-sign on that.
Yeah. It's not to say English is better. It's just that's what's going on in our heads when we put the articles together. All right, folks. I think that does it for tonight. Really fantastic episode. So grateful for everyone who joined in the live chat. Love you all. We will be back in 1 week with another episode of Iron Culture presented by Mass. Helms, I believe you're going to be back with me live 1 week from now. Is that right?
Yeah, I would actually have to look at the host schedule, but I will say this. We do have some pre-recorded episodes coming up. The last one we released actually on a Monday just to ease that transition, but they are going to be coming out on Wednesdays moving forward. And we've got some philosophy, we've got some history coming up. And I think we have a few more of the SNA Sigma Nutrition crossovers. I got one more of those left.
We got a lot going on, and of course, the holidays are coming up: Thanksgiving, Hanukkah, Christmas, the whole deal. And so there's gonna be a mixture of live episodes, pre-recorded episodes, etc. But my commitment to you, as the person who pulls all the levers and controls everything, we will be giving you something on YouTube by Monday, 7 p.m. Eastern time, and stuff is going to hit the podcast feed Wednesday at some point. Possibly late, because that is kind of a quick turnaround for a person who has 11 full-time jobs at the moment. But yeah, we will see you in exactly 1 week, and hopefully we'll be doing it live, and we'll see you in the live chat so we can answer some of your questions. So everyone have a wonderful week. If you happen to be in the United States and you happen to be celebrating Thanksgiving, enjoy it. Personally, it's my favorite holiday, Helms, because I'm a simple man. I like two things. I like football, and I love a good feast. So I'm going to be doing both, and it's going to be glorious. I know that they don't do any of that stuff across the world in New Zealand, but where I'm from, we do football and just unrestricted gluttony for a 24-hour window, and I can't wait.
Well, I'll be mini cutting, and I will maybe focus on a distant third aspect of Thanksgiving that I like, is just taking some time to reflect and see what I'm grateful for.
So I would normally earmark a little time window for that, but usually what I do is football. Maybe the game doesn't go the way I like. Then I eat past the point of discomfort. And by the end of the day, I'm like, I feel terrible. I'm angry. I've gotten in 7 political arguments around the dinner table, and none of them really made me feel good about myself. So it's just hard to squeeze that in, But to each their own.
Yeah, well, outside of the wonderful nation of the United States of America, I'll be skipping on the football and the political disagreements to therefore not feel terrible and then not be gluttonous and just focusing on gratitude. But I will definitely look to what I've heard is claimed the best nation in the world by a lot of very confident people who've never left their nation, and consider that as a potential way forward.
All right. Sounds good. Well, everyone have a great week, and we will be back in 7 days.